guys, this is Rachel here, the Modern Shaman. Thanks for being with me for another YouTube Q&A video of the week. You can still go to the landing page in order to connect with me, to get a session booked, or to find out more information about my masterclass and spiritual entrepreneur program. If any of those interest you, then I would encourage you to visit the website, themodernshaman.net. Also, I am still doing the follow-up from my trip to Egypt. 2 weeks ago, I started doing these videos about my trip to Egypt, and it has just been so much information. I literally thought I could cover it in one video, you guys. But then it just started like pouring out of me, and I mean, the trip was just epic. There's so much to share, and there were so many places we visited. So this is part 3 of that video. And my hope is that I'll get back to your regular Q&A after this. And my apologies to those of you guys who have sent in video questions. It's coming. It's all going into a little vat. I keep seeing things like the little witch's cauldron, you know, it's going into this big vat, and I will pull out your questions and answer them one by one. I promise. But thanks for your patience, because this video, I started talking last time about the fact that we did a Nile River cruise in Egypt, and on that cruise we visited a lot of different temples. It started at Luxor. We did the Valley of the Kings and a lot of the desert touring type stuff, and I shared with you all that I wasn't super drawn to the energy of the tombs. They were beautiful, and Egyptian tombs are very unique in the way that they believe that the afterlife essentially mimicked the house or home that you created for them as a tomb. So they saved all of their everyday living functional things and put them in the tomb, so that when they awoke, they didn't believe in death. They didn't actually even have a word in Egyptian and hieroglyphics for death. The word is westing, like going west, because all of the tombs and the afterlife was on the west side of the Nile. So the east side is where they had their cities and their temples and their living, the land of the living. And then they had the Nile, which was the blood or their sacred lifeline, which they connected to the spine, the pranic tube, the flow of energy similar to our chakra system, and that was the Nile River. And then on the west side, when you would west, or if you were westing, you were essentially dying or going towards the west, and that was where the tombs were. There were some dynamics of living there, but it was mostly for those who built the tombs. Like, there were small towns or communities, I wouldn't even say towns, but communities of workers that were artisans that kind of lived on the west side of the Nile, but it was very few and far between. And the energy there, as I shared with you with the tombs, to me was not as active. It was a little more dead. No pun intended. Like, the energy just felt more stagnant and not as active and alive. And so, again, I appreciated them, but I really enjoyed the pyramids and the old temple. So after we were on the Nile cruise, we went to Aswan, and in Aswan, a little further down on the Nile, we went to Karnak. We went to, actually, Karnak and the Temple of Luxor are in Luxor. Before we got to Aswan, that was, I think that was the Temple of Isis, which is also called the Temple of Philae, the Temple of Love, the Greek goddess. And then we also went to the Temple of the Crocodile, Kom Ombo, let me tell you a little bit about Karnak and about Luxor. These two temples, the Temple of Karnak and the Temple of Luxor, were connected by this grand kind of promenade, walkway for like a mile, but it was flanked on both sides by sphinxes, smaller sphinxes. And I talked before about how sphinxes were like a symbol of power, and the face that would be on the sphinx was different depending on the ruler of that day, the pharaoh of that day. And so the whole promenade that connected the two temples on two sides of the city of Luxor, when it was the capital city, had various faces on the sphinxes. Some of those are still intact. And they're not large. They're probably about the size, like 5 foot tall, but they're horizontal on their little podium. And they are still fixing that promenade. It is an amazing sight. They have them all lit up at night. A lot of these temples are phenomenal at night. They have these light shows because if people come out at night in Egypt, I don't know if I mentioned that, but because it's so hot during the day, it was probably like 109 when we were in the desert. And it's so hot in the desert, especially in the Valley of the Tombs, because of the Valley of the Kings, where the tombs were, because the wind can't get in. It's really high desert mountains on both sides. So it's very, very hot in there. But anyways, so the people all come out at night and have a good time at night. And dinner starts late, and it's just a lot of lively energy at night. So these temples are lit up beautifully at night, and a lot of the statues you can see. You can't read a lot of the hieroglyphics at that time, but it's also a great time to tour at night. And that also means that you are sightseeing from morning till evening, way late into the evening, if you're trying to get it all in. When we went to Karnak, there's still a lot of Karnak that is uncovered, that is still being worked on, and there's still groups of archaeologists that are there because it is huge. I think it's second in size only to Angkor Wat in terms of a temple facility. What you can access is kind of the bones of the temple, and the structure of this temple is beautifully laid out, and it is processed at the beginning to house people to come in, similar to the way that like a town square, similar. So there are kind of vending areas, or areas where people would come to have their sacrifices, and huge alabaster platforms where people would put their sacrifices for thousands and thousands of years. And it's neat to see how the alabaster and the marble area, there's some that are granite, some that are alabaster, and it has literally kind of become concave after thousands of years of utilizing that as an altar table, and they still sit there in their same location. To me, this outer space, the energy felt very circular. It felt like kind of like a whirlpool. And it reminded me of the energy of Mecca. And Mecca also, actually, those pilgrims that go to Mecca, they circle it like this. It has a very centralized, centrifuge type of energy in that area of the outside of the Temple of Karnak. And I'm not sure if people walked it like this or if they just came straight in, even though the visual direction is very linear. You have the outside area where the sacrifices were made. Then you have the holier area where there were prayers and where the temple priests lived. And then you have the Holy of Holies where the sacraments and icons and just holy deities, a lot of statues of their holiest deities were there, and only the high priests were allowed in there. This is the same structure that the original Hebrew temple had the outside area where they, if you've read the Old Testament, it's the same structural format. The Egyptians were doing this structure 3,500 years before. Actually, we don't know we don't know exactly when that timeline is of when the original Hebrew temple was built. But anyways, the Egyptians have been doing this for a very long time. It's a similar structure with the Holy of Holies, and it's literally called that. What was interesting, as the structure gets smaller and smaller, the energy is more and more potent. And because, and I've shared this before, the stone technology, and I'm going to call it technology because it's very intelligent in the way that they chose the design, it begins to bounce the energy off, okay? Similar to like the way that you would walk into, if you're going to make a record and you'd walk into a particular sound booth, all right? Those booths are made with an intelligent sense of structure, and they are a technology in themselves for sound and how the acoustics are in certain areas. The same is true for the energetics in the Holy of Holies. This is typically all granite, which has the amplifiers within it, because granite has quartz crystals in it. The specks sometimes are smaller, sometimes they're larger. And everything in the Holy of Holies is typically painted and very ornate. From the ceiling, I mean, just everywhere. And all of this mimicking that sense of holiness or sacredness. Now, depending on the temple, the size of the area would be different, but there is typically still a small altar there that, to me, felt like a microphone or an amplifier of energy when you were there or standing right up against it. And it would be like ricocheting off, bouncing off the other smaller walls. So it was very powerful to be within the Holy of Holies. Some had windows and some didn't, depending on the temple. But they were very, very dark. They let less and less light in. Like the further out structures of where you would go to sacrifice would be outside courtyards, and then the spaces would get smaller and darker and darker. And again, kind of reflect that sense of sacredness and holiness and coming within. This structure, even in the way that it was made very, very intelligently in the way that it interacts with the human body, because the sensory aspect of my body, like I would get chill bumps just from being in the Holy of Holies, which is something to say, because these places now, when you go on these tours, there's a lot of people in there. There's people kind of hustling and bustling. It's a big tour place. So there's tour buses coming in and there's people coming in. And the fact that you can still feel the energy thousands of years later, to the point that as a clairsentient, my, hairs on my arms are standing up and I'm getting chill bumps in these hot Egyptian temples. It is phenomenal. I mean, there's something just to be stated for that. I promised I would talk about the scarab. So scarabs in Egyptian culture, and I highlighted a little bit of it in my previous video, are sacred. It is one of their holy symbols, sacred symbol, because it is asexual. It has both the female and the male sexual organs. It can create life all by itself. It is a perfectly sustained and embodied being. And the Egyptians recognized this, and they worshipped the beetle. It was a symbol of goodness, holiness, luck, fortune, of being able to be fully embodied in both masculine and feminine. This was a very holy quality. The priests actually, and the scribes and the holy men in Egyptian day wore wigs that were parted in the middle that looked like a woman's hair. And this was their sign of balance in the holiness of femininity and intuition, as well as the physical body that was masculine. So they would typically still have bare chested. They wouldn't cover their chest. But the priests and the holy scribes were the only ones that got to part their wig down the middle other than women. And it was a sign of that perfected sense of connection with the female and the male. So the same was true of the scarab, and they have a huge scarab granite. It's a statue, but it's like a holy relic there in Karnak, and I was incredibly drawn to this. And actually, Jude and I walked around it clockwise, then counterclockwise, which is what they also used to do as a sign of connection to the statue and a sign of a balanced energy, of moving in the feminine way and in the masculine way and in that holistic combination. And this huge scarab is right in front of their baptismal pool. Karnak has the largest baptismal pool. It is huge, and it's called that. It was a pool for purification when coming into the temple. And it is not just, it's not in the first round. It's like there are the sacrifices, and then there's the purification pool even further. It's out kind of towards the right. And the energy here is very holy. This is where the scarab is. And before they would perform the ritual of balance around that unified figure of the scarab, they would purify themselves, bathe themselves, and baptize themselves in the water to get rid of impurities before they would connect with the scarab. They also felt like the scarab was a representation of wisdom and all-knowing, because it would signal to them when the Nile would flood, because the beetles are scarabs, which means it's a type of beetle. But anyways, it would live in the dirt right near the water's edge. It would kind of burrow into the dirt. And when the Nile was about to flood, the beetles, the scarabs would all come out, and they would cover the land, and then they would go up to higher ground, and then they would burrow themselves in the edge of a higher ground. And everyone in the Egyptian culture would know that that's the height of where the flooding would end. And so everyone else would pack up and follow the scarabs as their kind of leader to show them the higher ground of this is safety and protection. And so the scarab was also viewed as one that knows all things, that can protect, that can tell them where to go. Oftentimes you'll see the scarab with wings outstretched, the falcon wings, and this was also a symbol of wisdom and protection. The wings often symbolize protection. They're protective birds, whether there's several protective birds that are part of Egyptian iconography. They have the ibis, they have the vulture, they have the falcon, they have several, but they're all symbolic of a sense of protection in various ways. I will say I was very drawn to this scarab and this outdoor purification. And to me, I don't know why, but this felt like, it felt white. And only my energy people will get what I'm saying, okay? This is a little form of synesthesia, if you've ever heard that term, where your senses kind of blend, okay? And there's a literal, when I can feel the colors. I can feel, and it felt white. Do you know what I'm talking about? It felt soft to me and feminine, but also very blanketed. You think of snow, like covered and protected. The energy there was a different kind of holiness. It was protected and thick and pure and clean. And you could absolutely feel that in the realm of that scarab. And it's still there, it's still intact. And people come all over the place to connect still with that scarab. It was very, very powerful. Luxor, which is also, Luxor Temple is also in Luxor. It stands on the opposite side of the town. And like I said, there's a promenade that connects it all the way towards Karnak. And we drove over there because it's very long to walk. It's like a mile. But we went over, and I think we took a horse-drawn carriage over there because they still travel a lot in that way because their roads are not quite, I mean, they're really rough on just regular car tires because they're still, just as a nation, there's a lot of potholes and a lot of just old roads and infrastructure there in terms of the city. But Luxor is a very powerful temple, and it feels like power. When you walk on the grounds, there is an awareness of power. Now, this has a lot of statues of Ramses up in the front, and Ramses was known as the builder in terms of the pharaohs. He built a ton. So a lot of the temples have him as their pharaoh or their icon, or he's etched in a lot of stuff. And he was kind of like the propaganda pharaoh. I don't know if y'all know a lot about kind of the pharaonic history, but remember, the temples were used kind of like town squares. These were where people came and saw one another, and it was a centralized area of connection for people during that day. And so a lot of the way that the leaders spoke to their people or the different areas that they reigned over was to put a temple in an area that they reigned over, and then to put images and pictorials and hieroglyphics of scenes of them in battle, all strong and beating their enemies with slaves at the bottom of the, you know, underneath their feet, or just symbols of their power and their strength and their might. They would make the statues incredibly tall, again, to elicit that response of awe and appreciation, like this is our leader and look how magnificent and powerful he is. And even the Egyptologists will say not all of these things are true that are on the walls. A lot of them were propaganda that the pharaohs wanted them to believe, that they won all of these historic military battles, some of which existed, some didn't. Or some battles they lost, but they portrayed that they won them. Because it was part of the strength of their nation or their pharaonic rule. So this temple, the Temple of Luxor, to me, felt like power. It had the energy, a very strong masculine energy. And you can definitely feel it. It's massive in its height and its width, but the structure itself felt like it was more historical than energetically potent. I wasn't as drawn to it. To me, it felt like a show of power from a military leader, from a pharaonic leader that was very dominant and authoritative. That was the energy that I got from that Luxor temple. It doesn't mean that I didn't appreciate the beauty and what it took. The architectural marvel of these things is just phenomenal. It just is. But that was that. We also went to, guys, I'm already at 24 minutes. I gotta talk faster. We went to Kom-Ombo, which was another temple that I was fascinated by. And this sounds dark, but it wasn't dark. So this was the temple of their crocodile god. It was actually the temple of Set, which is their god of destruction, okay? Their antithesis god. And Set and Aten, which is the sun, the disk of the sun, the Aten, right? You put these together, it makes Satan, Sat, Aten. And this is a very interesting connection just with the phonetics of that passing on. And the crocodile god, they kind of worshipped the crocodile, or they at least they did worship it, but they went to the temple of the crocodile. They would feed the crocodile in hopes for protection. Now, the Egyptian god Set was kind of more like the Hindu god Shiva, right? It's the god of destruction, but it's also like protection. And it's kind of the destruction of the self or the things that are not good. It's the destruction of, it's kind of a destructive force, but it's not necessarily associated with the evil we think of when we think of Satan or demons, even though the crocodile was like a demon. That sounds strange, but the energy didn't feel that way because there was a sense of protection here, of that we all know that the crocodile can kill everybody, can, you know, bring about a lot of destruction upon the Nile, right? Which was their life force, their blood, their sense of living and being alive, because 90% of Egypt is desert. So they all depended on that lifeblood of that river. And so the destructive force there, they wanted to keep fed and happy, because if the crocodiles were fed, they didn't come after them, right? Or their crops or their people or any of their stuff. So there was a sense of respect and honor in this temple that was very balanced. To me, it felt very balanced. And also they mummified the crocodiles. They had like a crocodile pit there in the temple of a live crocodile. They kept several live, huge crocodiles. And then when they would pass away, they would mummify them. I mean, they were very holy figures, and mummification is a very expensive process during their day and timely. It took a lot of time. So, and then they buried them. There's a crocodile museum there where you can see all the mummified crocodiles. Kind of creepy, but but the energy of the temple was very reverent, okay, and balanced. It did have a heaviness to it that felt very grounded, I will say. And there were also areas in the back of that temple for medicinal help. So this was a temple that held a sense of healing. It was known as a healing temple because, like I said, their view of Set and the crocodile god, which was Sobek, but it was under Set and kind of his little dominion. It was also to rid the body of impurifications, and in a kind of aggressive way. But there were places in that temple where people would go for healing, and they had literally like a calendar, and they had a basically like a wall of prescriptions of what they would do to heal certain things. And as a healer, this was a fascinating and almost like little rooms where they would put people for medical healing and aspects of gaining connection through the impurification of the body or the clearing out of the body. And so there wasn't this maleficent force, even though there was a little bit, because they were afraid of that god in this sense of respect. But it was still viewed as a very hierarchical entity. And the energy there feels like it. It still feels very reverent, and it still feels like a place that people came when they really needed help. This is an interesting dynamic, isn't it? How that has shifted over the many thousands and thousands of years. Instead of viewing dark and light as forces that essentially come together to heal and make holistic the human experience as a polarity, as bringing about unification or oneness. Instead, there's a very vilified kind of evil view that we have of darkness, and they didn't really have that same view. It's shifted a lot. I think I'm going to cut it there. I'm at 30 minutes, and I have loved sharing with you all. I have loved sharing has such a magnification also. And I know that sometimes when people go on their own trips, and I don't get to go to certain places, but I really glean and benefit from the energy of people's pictures and sharing stories. And just when you're sensitive to energy, you can feel it through someone else's video or someone else's photos or someone else's stories. It literally translates in our own experience. So it's my hope that this video or these last 3 videos will do that for you all, and that it blesses you in some way, shape, or form. I will sign off here, and I'll be back next week with another video. Bye, you guys.